The single hardest milestone in quantum computing is not building more qubits. It is making a logical qubit that actually gets better when you add more physical ones. Google spent years chasing that line. IBM has been publishing roadmaps toward it. And then a Chinese team reports crossing it, with an error suppression factor that grows at each step up in code distance on a processor called Zuchongzhi 3.2 in a result that landed as a preprint and has not yet cleared peer review. That last sentence matters, but so does everything before it. Before you slot this into Chinese hype, or Western panic, neither framing survives contact with what the experiment actually claims and what the field's own definitions require. The threshold is not a performance benchmark like clock speed or qubit count. It is the precondition. Everything after it, useful fault-tolerant quantum computation, only works if you are below it. Above the threshold, quantum error correction makes things worse. Below it, adding more physical qubits makes your logical qubit more reliable. That is the line the entire field has been organized around for years, and the team behind Zuchongzhi 3.2 is now claiming they have crossed it. By the end of this, you will understand exactly what below threshold means, and why it is the right line to watch, what the Zuchongzhi 3.2 experiment claims, and what it does not prove, and what it would actually mean, strategically, not just technically, if China has genuinely made the crossing. This is not a story about one experiment or one machine. It is about who is raising the floor that the rest of the field must now match. To understand why that floor matters, you need to understand the threshold itself, because it is one of the more counterintuitive ideas in modern computing. Think of physical qubits as witnesses in a courtroom. One witness makes mistakes, but 5 witnesses who are each mostly reliable will catch each other's errors and converge on the truth. They can vote, correct each other, triangulate. The problem is that this only works if each individual witness is reliable enough to begin with. If every one of them is too unreliable, adding more witnesses does not help. 5 confused witnesses do not produce clarity, they produce 5 times the confusion. The threshold is the individual reliability level where the majority vote starts actually working. Below it, more witnesses means more truth. Above it, more witnesses means more noise. That is what a surface code does. It takes a large lattice of physical qubits, each imperfect, each prone to error, and weaves them together into one logical qubit that is protected by the redundancy of the group. The size of that lattice is described by the code distance, the number of physical qubits along one side. A distance 7 surface code requires on the order of 97 physical qubits to encode a single logical qubit. That is not a typo. Nearly 100 noisy physical qubits working together to produce one cleaner logical qubit. And that only works if the physical qubits are reliable enough individually that the weave sheds errors rather than amplifying them. The suppression factor is how you measure whether the weave is helping. It tells you how much the logical error rate drops each time you increase the code distance by 1 step. A suppression factor above 1 and growing as you scale is the specific fingerprint the entire field has been chasing as proof that error correction is genuinely working. If that factor grows as you add more physical qubits, you are below threshold. If it shrinks, you are above it, and your error correction is making things worse. The direction of that number is the whole story. So what can you build once you are below threshold? Not a useful quantum computer yet, and that qualification matters enormously, so hold it. But you can start building logical qubits that improve as you scale. Without crossing this line, every quantum computer in existence is a research instrument. With it, the path to fault-tolerant computation opens. Everything else in this field, every algorithm, every proposed application, every claimed future advantage, depends on this crossing happening first. Now, who was supposed to make that crossing? The accepted picture going into 2024 and 2025 was that the threshold would be a Western-first story. Google, IBM, and Microsoft were the credible contenders. The reason was not just funding, it was the full stack requirement. To cross the threshold, you need physical qubits with low enough individual error rates, a classical control system fast and precise enough to run the error correction cycles in real time, error correction software that implements the surface code correctly, and the engineering discipline to hold all of that together at scale simultaneously. Each one of those layers is a hard problem. All of them together, working in concert, was considered the domain of a small club with years of peer-reviewed publications behind them. Google's Willow chip reported in Nature in 2024 demonstrated below threshold behavior with a suppression factor above 2. That result was peer-reviewed, independently scrutinized, and widely recognized as a landmark. It put Google at the front of the club. IBM has been publishing its own error correction demonstrations and roadmaps toward fault tolerance. The expectation was that these programs, with their established publication records and infrastructure, would define what below threshold looked like for years. And then the Zuchongzhi 3.2 preprint arrived, reporting a suppression factor of roughly 1.4 per step up in code distance at distance -7 below the threshold. Here's what that number actually means, because you planted a question about it at the start, and it deserves a straight answer. A suppression factor of 1.4 is below threshold. The direction is right. The math is working in the right direction. But it is lower than Google Willow's reported figure of above 2. That gap matters. It means China is in the club, but with less margin than the current peer-reviewed benchmark. The claim is not China is ahead of Google. The claim is China has crossed the line. Those are very different statements, and conflating them is how bad analysis happens. If the experiments are measuring the same thing, and that methodological question is genuinely open until peer review, China is below threshold, but trailing the leading suppression factor. How did the Zuchongzhi team get here at all, given the constraints they were operating under? Superconducting qubit fabrication does not require the most advanced classical semiconductor nodes. The physical qubits themselves can be made with processes that are not at the frontier of what export controls have targeted. The harder constraint is the classical control layer, the high-speed, low-latency electronics that run the error correction cycles in real time, reading out qubits and applying corrections faster than errors accumulate. That is where export restrictions have focused, and that is precisely what the Zuchongzhi 3.2 preprint does not specify. The control hardware provenance is not detailed in what is publicly available. This is not a trivial gap. The classical control layer is where many quantum programs hit their scaling wall, and whether China has solved that problem domestically, found an alternative, or navigated around restrictions some other way is one of the genuinely open questions this result raises. What we know is that the experiment ran. What we do not know is exactly what it ran on. The Zuchongzhi line does have a prior record of peer-reviewed publications on superconducting qubit performance. That history does not validate the current preprint, but it does establish that this is not a team publishing its first result with no track record. The directional signature they are reporting, suppression growing with code distance, is exactly the signature the field has defined as the threshold proof. Whether it holds under scrutiny is the question. The question is serious, which brings us to what the preprint status actually costs the claim. Below threshold is technically precise. It requires showing that the logical error rate decreases as code distance increases, and the suppression factor is the measured version of that requirement. But this measurement is sensitive to choices that only peer review will fully expose. How are leakage errors treated, qubits that escape to states outside the computational space? Are they counted in the suppression factor or excluded? How is the factor calculated, and is that calculation directly comparable to the methodology Google used for Willow? These are not pedantic objections. They are the specific things that can make a suppression factor of 1.4 look different from what it appears to be. And they are exactly what peer review methodology scrutiny is designed to catch. Google's Willow result went through that scrutiny and came out with its claims intact. Zuchongzhi 3.2 has not been through that process yet. The preprint is real enough to take seriously and uncertain enough to hold at arm's length. Researchers at every serious quantum program are reading it right now. The claim does not pause pending publication. But the claim's full weight does not land until peer review confirms the methodology. There's also the question of scale. Distance 7 is proof of principle territory. Practical fault-tolerant algorithms, the kind that would give quantum computers a genuine advantage over classical machines on real problems, are generally estimated to require code distances somewhere in the range of 20 to 50, depending on the algorithm. The gap between distance 7 and distance 20 is not a linear engineering climb. It is a scaling challenge that involves more physical qubits, more demanding control requirements, and more places for the whole system to break. Distance 7 says the direction is right. It does not say the destination is close. Now step back from the single result and ask what the pattern means. The history of critical technology races shows something consistent. The moment a second country credibly crosses a technical threshold, the threshold stops being a differentiator and becomes a floor. It is no longer the moat. It is the minimum. Once two serious programs are below threshold, the contest shifts. It is no longer about who crosses first. It is about suppression factor from 1.4 to 2 and above, code distance from 7 to 20 and beyond, logical qubit count from 1 to many, and the software and algorithm layer that eventually runs on top of all of it. China has reportedly entered that race, or is claiming to have done so. If this result replicates under peer review, every serious quantum program now has to ask a harder version of the same question. Are we improving our floor fast enough? The race is no longer across the threshold. It is how far above the threshold you can get, how fast, with how many logical qubits, running what algorithms. The floor just got raised. The ceiling, logical qubits performing real computational work at scale, is where the next phase of this contest will be decided. Here's my honest read on what that means. The triumphalist version, China has quantum supremacy, the West is behind, does not survive the evidence. The suppression factor is lower than Google's peer-reviewed benchmark, the result is a preprint, and distance 7 is a long way from a machine doing useful work. China has not lapped the field. On total quantum capability, Google and IBM are almost certainly still ahead. That reading requires you to ignore specific numbers, and specific numbers are the only thing worth trusting here. But the dismissive version, this is vendor noise, nothing changed, does not survive either. A below-threshold result with the right directional signature from a team with a credible prior publication record under export control constraints that were supposed to make this harder is not noise. It is a signal. Dismissing it requires you to believe the threshold claim is fabricated whole cloth, and nothing in the preprint's technical structure supports that level of skepticism. The honest read is narrower than both extremes. China has raised the floor, not won the race. Not proven the result is ironclad. Raise the floor that every serious program now has to stand on. And the more interesting question is not whether Google or IBM is still ahead, they almost certainly are on overall capability, but whether the gap between above the floor and well above the floor closes faster than the West's roadmaps assumed. Every floor that gets raised makes the ceiling the next contest. China has raised the fault tolerance floor. The ceiling, useful logical computation at scale, is where the next phase of this will be decided, and that race is now more crowded than most expected. So here's the debate I want your answer to. Bet A holds that crossing the threshold, even at distance 7, even in a preprint, is the moment that changed the strategic picture. That being in the club is what matters, and the margin comes later. Bet B holds that until peer review confirms the result, and someone demonstrates a logical qubit doing real computational work, this is evidence of progress, but not a shift in the competitive landscape. The picture changes when the methodology is confirmed, not before. I want your honest read in the comments, and I want to know why you are backing the bet you are backing. If you want to follow exactly how this result holds up under peer review, and what the next distance milestone tells us about where China's quantum program actually stands, subscribe. That is the story we are going to keep tracking. One logical qubit, woven from nearly 100 noisy ones, below the threshold. That is the floor that just got raised. Everything else follows from whether it holds.